Okay, so I have got my quilt top assembled, or it's all put together in strips, and I have to hitch those strips together. And I'm also going to get my borders ready. So my thin border is going to be this fabric, and this will be my thicker border. So I need 1-inch strips finished when they're sewn in, so I need to cut 1.5-inch strips of this one. And I need to cut 5.5-inch strips of this one so that when it's finished, it will be a 5-inch strip on my border of my quilt. So I will get myself ready and start again. Okay, so I have lined my piece of fabric up. I've made sure it's square. I've lined it up along one of the straight lines on my grid, and now I'm going to trim off the end just like we did before. Trash, and then I'm going to cut 1.5-inch strips. And again, because I like to do things the lazy way, I'm going to spin my ruler and use the 1.5-inch line. Line that up with the cut edge, top to bottom. Put this ruler right up against it, making sure not to move the other ruler. Then I slide this one away, and then I'm cutting a 1.5-inch strip. And I repeat this because I need 5 strips. And if I did it with one ruler, I'd spin the cutting table around, which I will do after this strip to show how to do it that way. But because if I were left-handed, it would be all set to use one ruler. So now I will take the cutting table, and because my fabric caught, that's what I try to avoid. So now I've moved my cutting table, and again I'm going to line up that 1.5 with the cut edge of my fabric, and I'm going to cut from side to side. And that's 4. And this is going to be 5. And then I should have enough left of this, which I plan to use for my binding. For my larger borders, I've already got a straight edge because I cut out my half square triangle pieces. So what I will do on this one is lie it this way. And this time I'm going to line up the 5.5-inch line with my cut edge, top to bottom. And again, I'm going to cut 5. So I've got my very bottom row and my second to bottom row, and I'm going to line them up, and I'm going to again nest those seams just like we did with our star. We're going to slide the seams together so they butt up perfectly, and then you can use a pin, and my pin is going right in where the seam is, and I can always double check by flipping it this way and looking to say, okay, my seams are coming together nicely, and I'm going to stitch down that long side. And I will probably go stop and nest my seams with my hand rather than pinning them all, but you can do it whatever way makes you the most comfortable. sometimes there's a bit of easing along the way, but there shouldn't have to be much because we should have squared up all our blocks nicely so that they're all the same size. And that's why we square our blocks up and make sure that we square them up all to be the same size, because then they go together very easily. See, I'm always working about 8 inches ahead, making sure that I bring things together. And because I pressed each row in a different direction, it makes it easier to nest the seams because they're each headed a different direction. The row with the star in it is a little bit harder to get that way, and if it works out there not, you'll just have to be a bit fussier as you get to those seams. And my seams are very good. Are they perfect? I don't think so. But that's not what I actually focus on the most, is perfection. I like them to be good enough. And my first one is probably the worst because I took the pin out. I'm actually a big finger person rather than a pin person. That one is off by 1/8 of an inch, and I may well pick that out and fix it. And I'm going to continue and do this for all the rows until my inner part of my quilt top is all put together. So this is where it matters more because I'm now on my second row, and I want to make sure that my star is on the right side, correct side of the quilt from how I had it laid out. And because I pushed the other ones from right to left, on this one, I'm actually going to start on this side and I'm going to go from left to right. So I have to spin my piece around so that it's easier for me because I am right-handed. Okay, now that we've cut all our strips and we've got them all arranged, we're going to join them. There are 2 ways to join strips. You can do a butt join, which is basically you're just doing a straight seam across and you'll get a join like that. I tend not to do that kind of join because unless I'm very tight on my fabric and I don't want to run out, in which case I will do this because you save a little bit of fabric. If you're down to that you got 4 inches that you need that you're not sure you have, this is the way to go. But what I like to do is a diagonal seam, and we have our selvage pieces still on here on both sides, so I am going to make my overhangs a little bit larger than I need to. But I always bring from the left, right side up, going horizontally. From the right is right side down, going vertically. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a line which goes from the corner that's been made to the corner. So I've got my little line there, and I can put a pin or 2. I don't need the pin to hold necessarily where I'm going to stitch, but I want to hold my, but I'll do one for the purpose of illustration here. If that pin is my stitching line. So once I've stitched, then what happens is I have a long continuous piece with a diagonal seam. And especially if you have a print, an overall print, that seam tends to disappear when it's done that way. But I won't pin it that way to stitch it. I would just put a pin over here to hold the 2 pieces so they're perpendicular. Then I would take it over here to the sewing machine And I would probably drop my needle down, slide right up so that the line is right up against my needle. That going right straight out, there's the line that I'm going to stitch on. That needs to be back in there. I just bumped it out again. And then I'm going to stitch right straight across. And I come right out the other side. And then what I will do is pull my pins and show, and you can see okay, so we've stitched our various things together. We've left our diagonal seam there. Now we need to trim off our seam allowance. And so I'm lining that 1/4 inch mark up on the actual seam, and then I'll just run my rotary cutter there. You could do this with your scissors. It's not a big deal. It doesn't have to be done with the rotary cutter. And then the other thing you want to do is trim those little ends off. And I do like to use my ruler on this because I like to make sure I don't accidentally cut the wrong place. Because there would be nothing worse than veering in the wrong direction and spoiling the whole thing that you've just done. So there it is. I will press the seam open, and there I have that diagonal seam. So our quilt is now, our top is made. We've done our borders. We've got them sewn together in a big long strip and stretched out. Right now, for the purposes of illustration, I'm going to pretend that this is my entire quilt top. So what I will be doing is I will be measuring along the long side from end to end, and it is 26.5 inches. Then I would measure the other side as well. Let's see, can you see? No. I'll measure the other side as well and hope that that is 26.5 inches or within a very 1/4 of an inch or a 1/2 inch, but for me it is at 26.5. So then if this were my entire quilt top, I would cut 2 pieces 26.5 inches and sew them on each long side. Because this is not my entire quilt top, this is my entire quilt top folded down into quarters, I'm going to do 26.5 times 2, which will be 53 inches. And sew it all along both long sides. And this is a case where we want the 2 pieces to be the same length because up till now we've been squaring everything up, and sometimes we still come off a little bit off, but we really want our finished quilt to be square. So we are telling the quilt it will be 53 inches long on both sides when we put our short borders or narrow borders on. And it will be, I haven't measured across this way yet, it will be 19 inches, so plus the border, so it would be 20 1/4 or 40 1/2. And we can again check. Ideally, it's the same at different points along the way. And that's because you really should spread your quilt out and measure it in 3 places, top to bottom and side to side, and make sure your measurements are within 1/4 inch of each other. And then take, with 1/4 inch, you can stretch a bit, shrink a bit, ease it on, hitch. You want to hitch both sides, hitch the middle, and then you might use more pins this way, but you want to ease it in or stretch it a little bit. You don't want to do much more than 1/4 inch across the length of your quilt, because then it becomes obvious. Then you need to come and talk with someone and figure out, first of all, where you went wrong, and second of all, how you can easily correct it. But for us, we're going to first sew the pieces on the long sides, and then we'll sew across the short sides. So I'm going to go cut my thin strips. I think I said, well, I'll double check my measurement. I'll sew them on the 2 long sides, then I'll come back and remeasure across. So we're going to take our raw edges even of our strip, line it up along the raw edges of our quilt, stitching down from one side to the other, 1/4 inch seam allowance down the longer side. Go a little bit, stop and get yourself organized, go a little bit more. Now this is a case if you want to pin at the bottom end to make sure that you end up at the right place, and if you want to pin in the middle, it's okay. You want to match your raw edges up because it has to start together and finish together. And if you fold it in half along the way, you can fold them both and match the centers. So let's see here. That's about the center there. And a pin there. And despite what they might have taught you in home ec class, it's always better not to sew over pins, because yes, in general, most often the needle will go one side or the other of the pin, or it will bounce off of it. But every once in a while, like smack dab, you'll break your pin, you'll break your needle, and you'll have to rethread your machine and start that seam all over again, partway back. So it's just easier to pull your pins before you get to them. It's better for your machine. And because that's popping up, we'll lift the foot up and make sure it gets over. And I like having the needle down feature because that way I can rearrange things as I go along, and I know my fabric is never going to shift underneath the foot. If your machine has that as a possibility, I would choose it because this machine has a cutter. It stops with the needle down, and then whenever you hit the end of the seam, you cut the thread and it brings the needle up. So I don't have to constantly move my needle up and down. This is a Baby Lock Jane, and it's been replaced with a different model now. It has a different name, but it is a straight stitch going fast machine. It's really fun. It makes piecing quilts easy. It uses the Baby Lock 1/4 inch foot, which is still a great foot. and it goes really fast. However, I also have a FOF machine that has a built-in IDT, which is the equivalent of a walking foot, which I will always use if I'm quilting or working on something that's a list that I want to make sure the top layer and the bottom layer end together. And if they argue, so the machine you have has many capabilities, I'm sure. And this is a time when sometimes you get to play with some different ones. If all you've ever done is used it to hem pants so they're the right length, this is time you get to break out and find some other things it can do. So there is one side all done. I'm going to press it out. I'm going to press the seam towards the border. And I'll go on to the other side. Again, matching the right sides together, raw edges even. I'll start this time with a pin at both ends. And then find the middle and put a pin there. And because we did our joins the way we did, we'll end up with seams randomly spread out. See, there's a seam down here on this one. I prefer to have the seams random. I don't like them to all line up. And that's why I like the diagonal seaming, because they disappear. If you have the butted seam, to me, it always is much more obvious that there's a seam there. I like my seams to disappear. If your quilt sides are all smaller than the width of a fabric, which is 44 inches or so, you don't need to seam them together at all. You just use full pieces and you'll be just fine. But in general, you're going to have to seam them. And there are, like I said, there are multiple ways to do it. And it's good to know that there multiple ways exist. Now, some of you are using your inner border fabric is the same as one of your field fabrics. I originally was going to make the star out of this and decided that I liked the dark green for the star. So this didn't get used until the border, and I'm then going to use it also for the binding. It's part of my original 5. It's just that I changed my mind. And again, that's okay. Be careful not to let your quilt get caught up underneath, because sometimes it will show up in your seam. Ask me how I know about that. Many mistakes can be called design opportunities, but catching the bulk of your quilt in the seam of your border doesn't really count as a design opportunity. That's an outright mistake that has to be unpicked and fixed. And some of you may have noticed I have been backstitching occasionally. It's still not really necessary because I'm using a short stitch length and everything I've stitched is going to have another seam encapsulating it. If you're going to be, you're going to be trimming, or if you're going to be enclosing it in another seam, it will be caught. When you're at the edge and you're going to be handling a lot, then sometimes it's better to do a back stitch of just a couple stitches, though it doesn't need to be that long. It just needs to be, 2 or 3 stitches forward, backwards. That's enough to catch it. You shouldn't be working it so hard that you're in danger of anything happening to your seams when you're making your quilt top. Okay, same thing we're gonna do with the long borders that we did with the wide borders that we did with the narrow borders. We're starting on the long sides. We're putting the right side of our border against the right side of our narrow border, matching both ends, and then we're going to stitch down the long side. First one side, then the other side. And I've measured both sides and they're both the same, and I've cut the two wide borders to fit that measurement, which in my case I believe is 55.5. But it's been a few minutes since I've walked over there to do that, so I could be wrong. And I will be editing this because it's a mess. And as always, I'm letting the machine pull the fabric through. I'm not pushing it. I'm just guiding it, trying to make sure it stays at the same seam allowance. And if you have difficulty keeping your seam allowance consistent, there are two different types of feet. And I'll talk about this at the beginning. There's a foot with a guide, so you just butt your fabric up against it. There's also, you can get a magnetic guide that will hold onto your plate, and you can run your fabric along that. And I have both, but I don't know where they are right now. So I'm not showing them. In. And here I think I trimmed my short one a little bit off. Okay, because our quilt, we've put our borders on and measured it width-wise and height-wise. Had it been less than about 44 inches in its shorter dimension, we could have used one length of fabric, but our quilt is longer than that. So I bought 3 yards of fabric, and now I'm going to seam it together along the selvage. And I did the same thing of making sure that I hit the middle point and lining up the selvage's edge and making sure that I get a smooth fold. And then I'm gonna sew down the selvage. Actually, I'm gonna cut across the fold first and then sew down the selvage. And then I will have one piece of fabric that's big enough to be the back of my quilt, and this is what I chose. So I'm going to, first I'm folded it in half lengthwise. I've opened it up, it's been washed and dried. It's opened up, I've matched the cut edges, except that one side, they come together nicely. The other side, you can see there's a bit of a difference. I played with that to get, I think I started on this side and played with the fold. So what I'm gonna do now is go cut it at the fold, and then I'm gonna sew together this side, and that will be my bottom piece. And I'll be back shortly. Okay, I guess I realized I should probably show you how I do it. I have matched the edges and I've shifted it back and forth so that the other end is, the difference is as small as possible. And now I have this fold here running across the width of my fabric, and that's how I found my middle point. And so now I'm just going to cut at the fold. And I keep my hand here so that I keep the fabric together, and I just pull the scissors, and I'm not in the camera, sorry. I just go from edge to edge, and I'm cutting the two apart, and I want my scissors basically running sideways, but my hand doesn't go too well sideways. I'm just cutting against the fold. If you have concerns about your fabric shifting, feel free to pin right along about 2 inches in from the fold so that your fabric can't shift greatly. But I bought enough yardage so that you always want to have extra fabric on both sides. You want to have fabric hanging out. The backing has to be larger than the top, and the batting has to be larger than the top. All the trimming is done after you've quilted. So now it's cut into 2 pieces. So I'm going to sew it together along this side. Then I'll be back and I'll lay out my quilt. So I am back here on my design wall, basically, which is a bed. And I like using a bed because there's some friction and it will hold the bottom of the quilt in place. I have it lying down. See, there's my seam. It's a 1/4 inch seam. It was a deeper seam, but I trimmed it down. You want to cut off your selvages. So I stitched it first at wider than I needed, and then I trimmed it down to just about a 1/4 inch. It is going to run across the quilt on the shorter side in the middle. So I have that spread out and smooth with the wrong side up. So now I'm going to get the batting and spread it on top. So now I have my batting spread on top of my backing, and you can see the sort of dark edge where the backing peeks through. I took my batting and ironed it gently, trying to get most of the wrinkles out. I've got a few more to smooth out. And after it's smooth, then I'll get the top and put it on. Okay, I have my quilt. I have started to spread it out. I spend a lot of time smoothing as I go. My goal, this seam here is the center of my quilt. There's not a seam here, but my goal is to have that line up with the seam underneath. Just because it's not a requirement, but that's what I'm trying to do. The big thing is I want backing all the way, and I decided to try to center that seam on the back. But I want to smooth it out. I want to get most of the wrinkles out. I want to get bubbles missing. I want to make sure that there is backing extending beyond the top. It should be at least an inch wider on all sides. Ideally, it would be 2. I think my fabric maybe shrank a little bit more than I anticipated, but I'm not sure. And I'm going to go over here and I'm going to follow this midpoint here, and I'm going to reach under, and my seam is right here. So I'm pretty much spot on that my midpoint of my quilt is hitting the seam on the quilt. So my trick when I use my bed or a bed to spread things out is I then use a cutting pad and I slide it underneath, and then I have a surface that's hard underneath so that as I'm using my safety pins, I'm not pinning them to the bedspread on the bed. So I have my safety pins. I'm going to try to put a pin at least a hand width apart. I like to start kind of in the middle and work from there. So it's going to take me a while. I'll do a few more with the camera rolling, and then I'll probably turn it off. But see, those are hand apart, and then I do some more. And most of my pins I will take out as I'm quilting. There may be some that I have to take out when I'm done, but in general, especially if I'm coming to one when I'm doing my quilting stitches, I definitely want to pull it out. You're never going to want to stitch over a quilting pin. So I will continue pinning for a while and be back in a bit. Okay, now you can see I am all pin basted. I have pins basically a hand width apart, 3 or 4 inches over the whole top of the quilt. There is no quick and easy way to do it. It takes time. You always want to make sure that your pins do not take a huge bite of fabric. You want to see metal. Let's see if I can get this so you can see. You want your pin to just take a small bite of fabric. See how there's the fabric, the pin goes through the fabric, but there's pin on either side and it can slide. That's how you want your pin. You don't want it so snug that it's hard to close and that it creates a pucker. You want the pins to be able to lie flat. So we are pin basted all around, and the next thing we're going to do is we need to mark our quilt and get ready for quilting it. So I'll be back in a moment. I mean, if you go from here to there, that's 10.5 inches, so that's a little bit too far to go. But then you could go through the midpoints like there. So you could go there and there and there. You could do that all the way across the quilt. You could go along this line and along the tips here and along that line and the tips here. You could, if you wanted to do, you could do lines this way. You have to decide how you want to do your quilting before you start. And the one thing to remember is that when you're quilting, even if you find that this point doesn't go right straight through to that point, make sure that you tilt your ruler, because your eye will follow the line. And if your ruler was going like this to get from point to point and it went 1/4 of an inch, 1/2 inch away, no, we're not even. Okay. Let's start that again so you can see what I'm talking about. You want to quilt, if you're following, say, this line. From here, you're going from that corner all the way through. You want to make sure that as you're quilting, you're hitting that point, you're hitting this point, you're hitting that point. Sometimes that may involve shifting your line so that it's straight from point to point, but not necessarily straight from here to here. You want to go from this point to that point to this point. Your eye will follow it and say, wow, you did really well, because it's a straight line to all your points. If your line goes like this to get from point to point, if it went from there across here to get there, your eye would say, wow, that was really off, even if it was perfectly straight from that point to that point. So you have to be consistent in how you decide you're going to quilt your quilt. And as I said, 6 to 8 inches is all we have to do with our Quilter's Dream batting that we sell at So Creative. The biggest thing to remember is your quilt is at its weakest point when you're washing it. There's nothing wrong with washing a quilt, but when you take it out of the washer, support it. Don't grab one corner and pull, pull, pull. Take the whole thing, gather it up, and move it. Don't stress out those seams, because even though we've chosen to use polyester thread, it still has a stress point too, and water in batting is heavy. So I'm going to figure out how I'm going to draw my lines, and then I will come back and show you how I've drawn them, and then we get to go quilt next. Okay, I think you can see that I have done diagonal lines going through the lighter blocks, and I have gone across the star. You have a choice of, you could do a starburst in the center of the star. If you have an embroidery machine, you could embroider something in the center of the star. There are a lot of quilt patterns, and I opted not to do that on this one. I'm just continuing the quilting as it was. I will then also do echo quilting along the outside edge, along that, just outside that inner border. I will do some echo quilting, and I don't like stitch in the ditch personally, so I would rather echo quilt, which means there's a set distance outside of something, and usually about 1/4 of an inch is what I opt to do. So my quilting on the diagonal lines will be just in the field. It will start and stop at the edge of the border, and then I will quilt all the way around on the edge of the border. So I will go get my machine set up, and I'll come film a little bit of that for you to watch. Quilting is a case of, you start at the middle of your quilt and work to one side, and then flip your quilt over and work to the other side. There's a lot of rolling up the quilt to get it through the arm, through the neck there, but it can be done. So I'll show you a little bit about that in a bit. Okay, you'll notice that I have switched sewing machines. I am on a different sewing machine. I have a walking foot on. If you have a Pfaff sewing machine, it comes with an IDT, which is a built-in walking foot. When you're quilting frequently, it's easier to have a walking foot, because that makes sure the whole purpose of a walking foot is to keep all the layers moving through together. Many machines come with walking feet. Now if you look, it's very hard to see my line, but it goes through here, which means this safety pin is right where my foot is going to be going over. So I am going to pull this one out now before I start to stitch, and the others I will pull out as I get to them. So I will do a tie off at the beginning and a tie off at the end and stitch. I've got everything rolled up on both sides so that it fits through the throat of my machine easily, and you just start from the center and work out to one side, start from the center again and work out to the other side, and my diagonal lines are going to be quilted. So here we go. And I have a neat feature on this machine, and I can have a nice little straight line that shows me that I just line up that red line, which is where my needle is, with the line that I drew. So I'm going to take advantage of it. And I have it set up to stop with the needle down. so that I can hold my fabric in place and rearrange. And again, I'm lining up my little laser with the light. You do not need this. You can go, especially if you choose the right color chalk, you can see it more easily. But again, I'm making sure I go right through the points of my blocks so that the eye follows my line, and even if it's not perfectly straight, I'm pulling out pins as I approach them. Even if my line is not perfectly straight, it seems that way because it goes point to point. It's too close. It's too close. And here's my chalk line. So I'm lining up my So then I'm going to unroll this a little bit. I'm going to slide it back. And I'm going to start here at the start of my next diagonal line. And I want to get my needle to come right down in that corner there. And that is the end of my quilting on the field. But now I'm going to echo quilt around the outside. Okay, so now I'm going to start doing my edge stitching. I'm still using the walking foot because I have it. This can be done with a regular foot. You can put your 1/4-inch foot. You have lots of options, but I'm going to use this one. And as I get to pins, I'm trying to pull them out before I get too close. Again, I always like to stop with my needle down. That way, as I rearrange things, my fabric can't shift underneath the presser foot. So I don't have any sudden jigs and jags in my stitch line, which will happen if your needle is up occasionally. After you've gotten your edge quilting done around your inner border, you can take your pins out of the field because you don't need them anymore because you've got your quilting to hold your 3 layers together. So I will break and take out more pins and then I'll be back. Okay, so I did all my quilting of the field. I did 2 rows around the inner border because I felt like it, I guess. And then while I still had my walking foot on, I also edge stitched along the edge of the outer border, hitching all 3 layers together. Now I can take it to the cutting table and use my ruler to make sure that this is a steady, the same distance all the way around, and trim off all the extra now that we're getting ready to put our binding on. Okay, so now we're ready to trim off all of our extra that we don't trim until we're all set to put the binding on. So one of the key things is we'd actually like it to still be square, which you can use your ruler to see. I'm running it along the edge of the fabric there and along there, and it really is. The other thing you want to do is to measure and run your ruler on either side of your inner border and check to see that it's pretty consistent along the outside. And at this point it is. I will measure all the way around and make sure, but we put on a piece of fabric that was 5.5 inches. We should have 5 1/4 inches out from here, and if we look, 5 1/4, 5 1/4. And as I trim, you can do it this way. If you run this, you're trimming this along the edge of your raw edge of your outer border. You should be running at 5 1/4 on the inside. So that's 2 ways to check to make sure that your outer border is still square and straight. So now I will do the first trim with the camera on, and then I'll finish it with it off. And I just take my cutter, and again, holding it straight up and down, right along, and I've cut through all the layers there. So I will work my way around the quilt, and then I'll be back. So now it is all trimmed off, ready for the binding. And quilted too. So for the binding, I cut 2.5-inch strips. I seamed them together as I showed you, doing vertical seams. I trimmed the seams, I press them open, and then I fold it together, wrong sides together, right sides out. And I have a number, I think I cut 6 pieces. So I have a great big long, and we're using straight of grain binding, not bias binding. So I have left probably a good 12-inch tail. I have started stitching. I am sewing. I have my basic presser foot. So I'm basically sewing almost 3/8 of an inch in. I'm guiding it by the edge of the presser foot. And let's see. If I measure, it's almost 3/8 of an inch, which is about what I want, because I really want to be able to roll it over and catch both sides ideally. Okay, and now as I'm approaching the corner, I'm paying attention to where I am, because I am going to want to stop when my needle is basically at that point, which is about 1/4 of an inch in. So I'll go slowly. Okay, and that's where my needle was. I'm going to pick my presser foot up. I'm going to pivot my fabric, and this is my straight line that it's going to come down, and I'm going to go right down there, right off that point. I'm going to do a little tie off just before I finish and cut my stitches. Okay, so now I've cut my stitches. I'm going to take this piece, and I'm running it, folding it 45-degree angle here. This side is perpendicular, and I'm going to put my finger here, and I'm folding it back down on itself, and I want this fold here to run even with the raw edge there. And I'm going to very carefully scooch it under, put my foot down, adjust it so I'm stitching the right place. I'm going to, again, raw edge against the edge of my foot, and I'm going to start stitching, and I'm going to do a back stitch here, and then I'm going to go merrily on it my way, sewing my binding all the way down this side. But I'll go for a little bit, and then I'll show you why we're doing it that way. So I have left probably a good 12-inch tail. I have started stitching. I am sewing. I have my basic presser foot. So I'm basically sewing almost 3/8 of an inch in. I'm guiding it by the edge of the presser foot, and let's, if I measure, it's almost 3/8 of an inch, which is about what I want, because I really want to be able to roll it over and catch both sides ideally. Okay, and now as I'm approaching the corner, I'm paying attention to where I am, because I am going to want to stop when my needle is basically at that point, which is about 1/4 of an inch in. So I'll go slowly. Okay, and that's where my needle was. I'm going to pick my presser foot up. I'm going to pivot my fabric, and this is my straight line that it's going to come down, and I'm going to go right down there, right off that point. I'm going to do a little tie off just before I finish and cut my stitches. Okay, so now I've cut my stitches. I'm going to take this piece, and I'm running it, folding it 45-degree angle here. This side is perpendicular, and I'm going to put my finger here, and I'm folding it back down on itself, and I want this fold here to run even with the raw edge there. And I'm going to very carefully scooch it under, put my foot down, adjust it so I'm stitching the right place. I'm going to, again, raw edge against the edge of my foot, and I'm going to start stitching, and I'm going to do a back stitch here, and then I'm going to go merrily on it my way, sewing my binding all the way down this side. But I'll go for a little bit, and then I'll show you why we're doing it that way. So here's my corner that I just did. And what happens is when it comes time to fold it over to the other side, I get this nice, easily done mitered finish. There's a bit of playing with it to get it situated, cover the seam allowance, but I hope you can see that it's going to make it easy to get a nice, well-finished cut corner. So that's why we do that funky fold at each of our corners. And that's why you always start in the middle, so that you get something that looks like this as you're going around, but it makes it very nice to finish the other side. Now I'll just continue stitching, and I'll be back after I've got everything done. Okay, as I approach the end, I want to make sure to leave myself at least a 10-inch tail. So I will stop stitching right about here. Okay, so we are now at the point where we're ready to think about joining. And the best way to do this, I'm going to stop for a minute. Okay, so we have this gap here where we've not put any binding on yet. So what we're going to do is trying to hit the middle of the gap. So we're going to take this one piece, we're going to fold it back on itself. And it doesn't matter which side you cut first. We're going to cut it there, which is basically at the middle of our gap. Then we're going to open it out, and we're going to use this as our measure. Lining up the raw edges even there. We're going to bring this one over, and we're going to fold it back so that the folds at the raw, so basically we've overlapped by the width of our piece. So now I can bring this up, I'm holding it carefully, and I'm going to cut that. So this is going to be discarded. So there we've overlapped the width of our binding. Then, just like we did our diagonal seams before, this is why it matters to leave a gap. So our left one is horizontal. Our right one is going to be vertical. We're going to have right sides together. And you're going to kind of get your quilt up out of the way, and we're going to match these, and probably a pin or two here is easy because they get slippery, or makes it easier because they try to get away. And put that one there, and let me get my chalk, a ruler. So we want to stitch from this corner to this corner, and let's draw, chalk a line there. And if you want to check to make sure that it's going to come out okay, it's really easy. You put your pins right on that line. And then you should be able to pretend that that's your seam and look back on your thing and say, okay, that will go together. And you know that many times I have done it without checking. And before I figured out this left to right system, this has been my savior, because I would end up stitching it, taking it apart, stitching it again, thinking I had it right, and taking it apart again. So take the time, check it if you need to, and then take your pins out. Don't stitch right straight at pins. Stitch right along that line. And it's good to backstitch on this one, or reinforce. And then before I cut, I always double check again and see how that fits my space. I've got a nice diagonal seam there. So now I will trim my seam allowances. Very carefully. I don't want to accidentally cut the back side of the binding. And then you can take it to your iron and press them open. I tend to just finger press, but I do press the seam open. And then I line up my edges, and I'm going to continue overlapping my seam a little bit on each end and finish stitching. So now my binding is attached all the way around. So now I'm going to take my quilt and put it with the right side up, and I'm going to be folding the binding over and edge stitching right along the edge of my binding. And because I like my variegated thread, I'm not changing thread, but this is again a case where we didn't really talk about threads. You audition your threads just like you audition your fabrics and decide what works well for your quilt. You can use one that jumps out, or you can use one that disappears into your fabric. I really enjoy using variegated threads, so that's what I did on this. So I'm going to edge stitch this on. And I'm going to go all the way around, and when I get to the corners, I'm going to stop and I'm going to fiddle with them and make them look nice. My needle needs to be replaced. It sounds like it. I'm going to try to get through this seam and then, but when your needle starts to make that kind of funk, funk, funk sound, it's time to replace it. And mine is sometimes making it and sometimes not, so. And it's a long, slow process. This is where if you have binding clips, you can use them to hold things rather than trying to do it with your fingers. They work really, really well. We carry them. Unfortunately, as with many of my things right now, I haven't found all my boxes yet. Or I found the boxes, but I haven't opened them all yet, and the binding clips have not yet appeared. So I just go slow and steady. I'm tucking things underneath that I don't want hanging out. And I just edge stitch the edge of my binding as I go. So now I'm approaching my corner, so I push it out that way, and then I'm going to fold up that side and fold down this side and bring them together, trying to match that inner corner, and then this is a case where extra hands would be helpful, and as I said, binding clips make a huge difference. Needle down, turning the corner. I've manipulated the corner so that it holds its shape nicely. Then I'm continuing on to the next side. Again, edge stitching as I go. isn't it? And we've gone all the way around, and we now have a quilt. Now it's time to check for any loose little threads that need to be snipped, and then enjoy.